December 1967, Lower East Side, New York City. The kind of neighborhood where dreams came to die, where the American dream felt more like a distant rumor than a possibility. Frank Kowalski lived in apartment 4B of a five-story walk-up that had seen better decades. The heating barely worked. The walls were thin enough to hear every conversation, every argument, every life falling apart in stereo. Frank was 67 years old. He'd landed on Normandy Beach in 1944 when he was 23, survived the war, came home to marry his sweetheart Dorothy, worked 37 years at a Brooklyn factory making airplane parts. Dorothy died 2 years ago from cancer. The medical bills took everything. Social Security barely covered rent and food. The small pension wasn't enough. 3 months ago, Frank had done something that still kept him awake at night. He'd sold his guitar. It wasn't just any guitar. A 1943 Martin D18 that his father had given him before shipping out to Europe. Music will bring you home, his father had said, and it had in a way. Frank had played that guitar through the war, through marriage, through raising two kids who now lived on the other coast and called maybe twice a year. When Dorothy got sick, when the bills started piling up like snow in January, Frank had carried that guitar to a pawn shop on Delancey Street and walked out with $200 cash. He'd told himself it was practical. He didn't play much anymore anyway. Arthritis made his fingers stiff, and who wanted to hear an old man play old songs? But late at night, in the silence of apartment 4B, Frank would look at the empty corner where the guitar used to lean against the wall, and something inside him felt hollow. December was particularly brutal. The heat in the building worked sporadically, and Frank spent most evenings wrapped in blankets, listening to the sounds of his neighbors' lives through walls that might as well have been paper. The young Puerto Rican family downstairs arguing about bills, the old Italian woman next door talking to her cats, and from apartment 4C, directly across the hall, the noise that had been driving him crazy for the past 3 weeks. Someone was playing electric guitar, loud, distorted, chaotic sounds that seemed to start around 11 p.m. and continue until 2 or 3 in the morning. Not music, Frank thought, just noise. The kind of noise that kids these days called rock and roll. No melody, no structure, just volume and chaos and self-indulgence. Frank had served his country. He'd seen men die for freedom, for the right to live in peace, to come home and have quiet in their own apartments. This wasn't what he'd fought for. This wasn't respect for your neighbors, for your elders, for the sacrifices people had made. On December 18th, after 3 hours of what sounded like someone torturing an electric guitar, Frank had enough. He put on his slippers, walked across the narrow hallway, and knocked firmly on the door of 4C. The guitar stopped immediately. Footsteps approached the door. It opened to reveal a young black man, maybe mid-20s, with an enormous afro and clothes that looked like they'd been borrowed from a rainbow. He was holding a white electric guitar, unplugged now, but Frank could see the small amplifier behind him in the sparsely furnished apartment. "Yes, sir?" the young man said quietly. His voice was softer than Frank had expected, respectful even. Frank had prepared a speech about common courtesy, about working people who needed sleep, about respect for veterans who'd earned some peace and quiet. But looking at this kid, who seemed genuinely apologetic before Frank had even said anything, the anger deflated slightly. "The music," Frank said, "it's very loud. I live right across the hall, and the walls in this building." "Oh man, I'm sorry," the young man said immediately. "I didn't realize how thin these walls were. I'm usually at clubs during normal hours, so late night is the only time I can practice. But if it's bothering you, I'll figure something else out." Frank studied him. The kid seemed genuine, not defensive or rude like Frank had expected. "What's your name, son?" Jimi Hendrix. Frank Kowalski." They stood there for a moment, two men from different worlds, different generations, separated by 40 years, and everything that had happened in America during those decades. "Were you in the service?" Frank asked, noticing something in Jimmy's posture, a certain respect for authority that reminded him of young soldiers. "Yes, sir. Army. Just got discharged last year." That changed something. Frank's expression softened slightly. "Where did you serve?" "Fort Campbell, Kentucky. 101st Airborne. Never made it overseas, though. Jimmy's voice carried a hint of disappointment, as if he'd missed something important. Frank nodded slowly. I was 101st too, in France. Different war, I guess. They stood in the hallway, the dim overhead light creating a small pool of illumination around them, like two ships meeting in the dark. Look, Jimmy said, I really am sorry about the noise. I'm trying to make it as a musician, and this apartment is all I can afford right now. But I'll find somewhere else to practice. I don't want to cause problems for anyone, especially not for a veteran. Frank looked past Jimmy into the apartment. It was smaller than his own, barely furnished. A mattress on the floor, a couple of amplifiers, guitars leaning against the walls. No television, no radio, just instruments and the kind of poverty that Frank recognized because he was living it too. You making any money at it? Frank asked. The music? Jimmy shrugged. Some. I play clubs in the village mostly. Sometimes I make enough for food and rent, sometimes I don't. This month was rough. Frank understood that feeling. The uncertainty, the choice between groceries and heat, between medicine and rent. What kind of music do you play? Frank asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Blues mostly, rock and blues. I know it sounds like noise from out here, but it's... Jimmy paused, searching for words. It's how I talk, I guess. How I say things I can't say with regular words. Frank thought about his father's guitar, about the songs he used to play, about music as a language when words weren't enough. Different styles, maybe, but perhaps the same impulse. I used to play, Frank said quietly. Guitar, acoustic. Jimmy's eyes lit up. Really? What kind of music? Country blues, some folk songs, things my father taught me, nothing fancy. That's the foundation of everything, Jimmy said with genuine enthusiasm. Robert Johnson, Skip James, Mississippi, John Hurt. That's where it all comes from. Without that, electric guitar is just noise. Frank was surprised. He'd expected this kid to dismiss his kind of music as old-fashioned, irrelevant. Instead, Jimmy was talking about the same artists Frank had learned from, names Frank hadn't heard mentioned by anyone under 50 in years. You know those artists? Frank asked. Know them. They're my teachers. I must have worn out 5 copies of Robert Johnson records trying to figure out how he made one guitar sound like 3 people playing. Something shifted in Frank's chest. The hollow feeling he'd been carrying since selling the guitar suddenly felt less empty. What happened to your guitar? Jimmy asked as if he could sense something. Frank hesitated. Pride warred with honesty. Had to sell it. Medical bills for my wife before she passed. Needed the money more than the music, I guess. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentler. I'm sorry about your wife, Mr. Kowalski. And about your guitar. That's rough, man. It's just a thing, Frank said, but the words felt hollow. No, it's not, Jimmy said firmly. A guitar isn't just a thing, especially one that meant something to you. Music isn't just a thing. When you have to sell your voice, that's losing part of yourself. They stood in the hallway, 2 men who understood loss in different ways but recognized it in each other. Tell you what, Jimmy said, I'll keep the volume down after 11 p.m., but if you ever want to hear some real music, real blues, you're welcome to come over. I mean it. We could play together if you wanted. I've got an acoustic. Frank felt something he hadn't felt in months, interest in something beyond just getting through the day. I don't know if these old fingers still work, Frank said. Fingers don't forget, Jimmy replied. Trust me on that. That night, Frank went back to his apartment, but instead of feeling annoyed by the music from across the hall, he listened differently. He could hear the blues underneath the electricity, the patterns that connected this young man's music to the songs Frank had learned 50 years ago. It was louder, more intense, but the emotional core was the same. Someone using 6 strings to tell the truth about their life. 3 days later, Frank knocked on Jimmy's door again. This time, he wasn't carrying a complaint. You still got that acoustic? He asked when Jimmy opened the door. Jimmy's face broke into a huge smile. Yes, sir. Come on in. Jimmy's apartment in daylight was even smaller and more sparse than Frank had realized, but it was clean, organized around the music. Guitars were treated with respect, amplifiers carefully maintained. This wasn't the chaos of a careless young man. This was the workspace of someone serious about their craft. Jimi pulled out a beat-up acoustic guitar, a Gibson that had seen better decades but still held its tuning. He handed it to Frank with the same care someone might pass a baby. Frank's fingers found the frets automatically. Muscle memory from 40 years of playing. He strummed a simple G chord, and the sound filled the small room with warmth. "Oh man," Jimi said softly. "Yeah, your fingers remember." Frank played a simple blues progression, something he'd learned from his father, something his father had probably learned from his father. Simple, direct, honest. The guitar responded like an old friend he hadn't seen in months. Jimi listened with complete attention, the kind of respect Frank wasn't used to receiving from young people. "That's beautiful," Jimi said when Frank finished. "Can you show me that finger-picking pattern?" For the next hour, Frank taught Jimi the finger-picking techniques he'd learned decades ago, while Jimi showed Frank how to make an acoustic guitar produce some of the sounds Frank had thought only came from electric instruments. Different approaches, different generations, but the same language underneath it all. "You hungry?" Jimi asked eventually. "I was about to make some food." Frank's refrigerator at home contained mostly condiments and disappointment. "I could eat something." Jimi made scrambled eggs and toast on a hot plate. Simple food, but he cooked it with attention, like everything else he did. They ate sitting on milk crates in Jimmy's kitchen area, talking about music, about the war, about how hard it was to make rent in New York. "You know what's funny?" Frank said. "I spent 3 weeks thinking you were just making noise to annoy people. But you're working harder than most people I know. Just at something different than what I'm used to." "People hear electric guitar. They think it's just about being loud," Jimi replied. "But volume is just one tool, like a painter having different colors. Sometimes you need loud to say something, sometimes you need quiet. The music chooses, not me." Over the next few weeks, Frank started visiting Jimmy's apartment regularly. Sometimes they played together, Frank providing steady rhythm, while Jimi explored melody lines that seemed to come from somewhere beyond technique. Sometimes they just talked. Frank told Jimi about the war, about factory work, about Dorothy. Jimi told Frank about growing up in Seattle, about learning guitar from older musicians who taught him that respect came before talent, that tradition mattered even when you were trying to create something new. Frank learned that Jimi sent most of his money to his father back in Seattle, that he often went hungry so his dad could have enough to get by. Jimi learned that Frank hadn't spoken to his children in months, that he was too proud to tell them how difficult things had become since Dorothy died. On Christmas Eve, Frank came home to find a package outside his door. Inside was a guitar. Not his guitar, but a decent acoustic, older model but properly maintained. The note with it was simple. "Music will bring you home. Jimi." Frank knocked on Jimmy's door immediately. "I can't accept this," he said, but his hands were already holding the guitar like it belonged there. "It's not charity," Jimi said. "It's investment. I need someone to play rhythm when I'm working on new songs. Consider it a business arrangement." They both knew it wasn't, but it allowed Frank to accept the gift without losing dignity. On New Year's Eve, they played together for hours. Frank on acoustic, Jimi on a quiet electric amp, exploring how their different styles could complement each other. Neighbors started gathering in the hallway, listening through the thin walls to something they'd never heard before. 2 generations finding common ground in 6 strings and truth. Mrs. Rossini from next door knocked and asked if they could play "That'll Be the Day." Frank knew it, Jimi made it electric, and suddenly the narrow hallway was full of people singing along. By February, word had spread in the small clubs where Jimi played. Musicians started talking about the old guy who played rhythm with Jimi Hendrix, about how this unlikely partnership created something neither could achieve alone. Club owners started booking them as a duo. Frank had never played professional music before. At 67, stepping onto small stages in Greenwich Village, playing for audiences who came to hear music, not just endure it, he discovered that music could still surprise him. The money wasn't much, but split between them, it meant Frank could afford both heat and food. Jimi could focus on his music without wondering where next month's rent was coming from. More importantly, Frank wasn't alone anymore. Neither was Jimi. In March, Jimi got an offer to tour with a bigger band. Good money, real opportunities, but it meant leaving New York for 3 months. You should go, Frank told him when Jimmy explained the situation. This is what you've been working for. What about our gigs? What about the music we've been working on? I'll be here when you get back, Frank said. The music will be here too. This is your chance to take it to the world. Jimmy left in early April. Before he went, he made sure Frank had enough money to get by, enough work playing solo gigs to keep busy. He left his phone number, called every week from the road. The apartment hallway felt quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not empty silence, but peaceful quiet. Frank practiced his guitar every evening, worked on songs he and Jimmy had started together, got to know the other musicians in the neighborhood. By the time Jimmy returned in late June, Frank had become something of a local fixture in the village music scene. The old-timer who played traditional blues with a modern understanding, who could hold his own with musicians 40 years younger. Jimmy came back to New York with better equipment, better connections, more confidence. But the first thing he did was knock on Frank's door. "Want to play some music?" he asked. 20 years later, in 1987, Frank was interviewed by a music journalist writing about Jimi Hendrix's early years in New York. Jimmy had died in 1970, but his influence on music was still growing, still reaching new audiences. "What did you learn from him?" the journalist asked. Frank, now 87 and still playing guitar, thought carefully before answering. "I learned that courage sounds different to each generation," he said. "I thought courage was being quiet, not complaining, enduring whatever life gave you. Jimmy showed me that sometimes courage is making noise, refusing to be quiet, demanding that the world hear your truth. Both kinds of courage matter. We needed each other to understand that." "And what do you think he learned from you?" Frank smiled. "That tradition isn't the enemy of innovation. That respect for what came before doesn't limit what comes next. That an old man and a young man can play the same song and both be right." The journalist asked about Jimmy's death, about whether Frank had stayed in touch with Jimmy's family, about the legacy of their brief partnership. "Jimmy died too young," Frank said. "But in the 2 years I knew him, he taught me that it's never too late to find your voice again. I was ready to live quietly, to fade away without making any noise. Jimmy showed me that music doesn't age, doesn't become irrelevant. Only people do, and only if they choose to." "Do you still play?" Frank gestured toward the corner where a guitar leaned against the wall. Not the guitar Jimmy had given him. That one had been stolen years ago. But always a guitar, always music. "Every day," he said. "Jimmy's gone, but the conversation continues. Every time I play, I'm talking to him, arguing with him, learning from him. That's what music is. A conversation across time, across difference, across everything that tries to keep people apart." Frank Kowalski died in 1994 at the age of 94. At his funeral, local musicians played a mixture of traditional blues and electric rock, honoring both sides of the conversation that had defined the last 27 years of his life. Someone had placed a white Fender Stratocaster next to the acoustic guitar at the front of the service. A note attached read, "For Frank and Jimmy." The conversation continues. The story of the old veteran and the young rocker had become legend in Greenwich Village, told and retold, changing in details but constant in its core truth. Sometimes the most unlikely friendships create the most lasting music. Two men separated by 40 years, and everything that had changed in America during those decades had found common ground in 6 strings and the universal human need to be heard, to be understood, to be respected for who you are and where you come from. Frank had thought Jimmy's music was noise. Jimmy had proven that noise and music aren't opposites. They're different ways of telling the same truth. Sometimes the truth is quiet, sometimes it's loud, sometimes it comes from tradition, sometimes from innovation. But it's always the truth, and it always deserves to be heard.